DraftScience video. Yay. Yeah, don't know where I'm going again. So we'll just start with first, Holiday had made a mention in the video. I wish I got more direct responses than these, disconnected responses, but it doesn't matter. Little reference responses aren't very valuable. Talk about springs and oscillation. That's a good word. I'll write that one down. Yeah, so that's another thing I want to do is some word. I gotta. So look, if you have some important words, I'm going to I'll put my list of the postulates or whatever, and add a couple of words at the top, maybe. Of just concepts that have to be dealt with. Okay, so you got the concept of spin, polarization, magnetism, electricity, tension, vibration, and then tuning. I like the word tuning. That's something to play with. So these are just some I threw together. So vibration, I guess, would be tension would be a kind of related to this idea of oscillation. And so anyway, he brought up an elastic band, to kind of say something on this relevant to this coil idea, the spring unspring being the same as the rotation. It's just about distance being traveled. And I guess I would argue that elastics, rubber bands, are, because there is a molecule that's essentially coiled, it's essentially straight versus kinked. And I think I know Feynman, did a description of it, and I think it was related to heat. So I'm sure you must have seen that video. So one of the older ones, when it was pretty old, from the chair, the lectures from the chair. Yeah, it just sort of explained that, the mechanism. And the mechanism, again, I would say, is again changing of distance. When the molecules are straight, there's a straight line, less distance. When the molecules is bent, it's a crooked line, more distance. So again, it's about distance. But anyway, moving on. So I was sitting here thinking about this different thing, what I have to deal with, and thinking about the idea that there are certain facts that we know. Okay, so I'm going to try to compile a list of the things I think we know pretty sure, like polarization of light. So we know light has a shape. So I was thinking about this just being the tumbling idea. Like you could think of light as just spinning, on a center axis, and that would automatically give it a longer than width kind of thing. I mean, it would give it a shape that would be conducive to it having to be in a certain rotation in space for it to be able to fit through bars, which is polarization. So it sort of just does kind of say, okay, it's spinning. It's just a thing that spins as it's moving the speed of light. So it's eating space through its spinning motion. And that's the mechanism. And I'm not unsatisfied with that at all. It sort of does create a, tug of war, so to speak, or this idea of, not polarization, not the way I want to say it, the idea that there is a forward and a backward. When one part's going forward, the other part's going backward, kind of thing. Which I don't know if that really is connected to anything. I mean, but it's just this two different things. One's doing one thing, one's doing another thing. So, but I would want it to do. I guess from my perspective, I'm sort of saying, okay, well, let's take gravity. So what I've been thinking about is gravity and the forces that bond the atoms. I've got to come up with a model doesn't have to be right. It just has to be kind of closer. It has to be more. Yeah, it has to be closer so I can build on it. It has to be something kind of solid. And I'm just not quite solid yet. I'm solid on this idea that clearly, like a solar system, you can get the idea that pressure is holding atoms together. That there's the pressure that's forcing them together. But there's an extra mechanism in there. And I kind of analogize it to like the sun. The sun is producing energy. Okay, and you could almost argue that that energy is an anti-gravity force. Now, in the case of the sun, in the solar system, as far as I understand the mathematics, it's not much of a force. The photons flying off of the sun, I don't know if they're much of a force in dictating the orbits of the planets, or maintaining them. It might be, it might not be. I don't know. I don't know enough of the details of those specifics to be able to say whether it affects or has any significant impact. But clearly, it's this counter force. And so, in discussing what's holding atoms together, you would kind of argue that it's the same thing, the same gravity that's holding the solar system together. As my argument is the same gravity that's holding atoms together, but obviously it's functioning on a different level of magnitude because there's kind of less of it, proportional to size. You would almost argue that the impacts are coming less frequently, certainly in mass. It's not the grain, the grit, the frame rate, the pixels. Like I could increase this and you could see the little pixels. The pixels are different. So it's a grainier universe that the atoms are existing in. That's why they're doing all this vibrating. It's because they're existing in a world that isn't as dense, and so it has more variation in it. It's not as smooth as this in terms of this color, and everything gets blended much better because of the raw density of the world we live in. So any variation is blended out. You just won't see it. But atoms see it, as they're living in a field of gravity that isn't as consistent. Let's say it that way, maybe. So anyway, but there's this idea of the model of the atom with the the set orbits. The idea that you kind of have to argue that there must be a counter force to this. So you have this force that's pushing things like gravity, and you have this idea of a nucleus that's doing the blocking of the force, technically, to provide reason for something to want to go towards the center, to be constantly pushed towards that center because there's a lower pressure here created by the blocked gravity. So part of what I've talked about in magnetism, so I think this is a magnetic effect in atoms. And so magnetism can be looked at as like this sun effect. Like something goes in, or something's inside of it, and then something comes out. And so I think I could argue that we might be able to understand gravity as being polarized like other photons, and that it has this spin thing, clockwise, counterclockwise, let's say. This doesn't matter, it's just there's two kinds, it's the only point to be made. And clockwise and counterclockwise seems okay, let's use those two kinds. And the point of magnetism is that, so let's just say gravity itself, if you have a body just by itself, and it's got this constant pressure, and what I'm sort of arguing is that as gravity goes into something, what's exchanged is directional information. So it changes the impetus, the shape of the molecules inside, in the sense that it adds a little pressure going this way and it leaves in some other direction. So let's say the gravity goes in, the photon gravity, the graviton goes in one direction and it comes out in another direction. Something less than the direction it went in. And what it leaves behind is a tendency or a shape change in the atoms that might make it tend to go in that direction. And that's the acceleration that's created. But it's a tendency that it's not a one-time impetus of acceleration. It may well be, but see, again, the thing I have to account for is the fact that something, once it gains acceleration, once acceleration is imposed, it maintains that velocity, the velocity created by that acceleration, theoretically, forever. So there's something in the matter itself So if somebody propels me into space and I'm traveling through space, the fact is my body is doing that. There's no, by my argument, there's no such thing as momentum. So what I'm basically arguing is that the fish that make me up, all the little individual fish, a preponderance of them, more of them, not a preponderance, more of them are swimming in this direction than are swimming in this direction per unit of time. And that's why I'm moving in that direction, is more of my fish are tending to go in that direction. So it's a permanent change in the pattern of my atoms that is creating my velocity. And let's understand that our velocities, that the ones that we are familiar with, are, on a to the millionth scale of like the speed of light. I mean, our velocities are minusculely insignificant compared to the velocities of the fish. The fish are moving really, really fast, and it only takes a little bit of more fish going in a direction for our bodies to be going, 100,000 miles an hour. It would only take a slight percentage of those fish. Only a tiny 0.0001% of those fish would have to be going in this direction versus this direction for me to be traveling 100,000 miles an hour. So anyway, so magnetism, I'm arguing, is a phenomenon of, let's say, gravity. That gravity is essentially creating it, and that it's gravity in. And what's happening with magnetism, it's like polarization. Magnets are filters, and what they're doing is they're filtering spin. And so let's argue that what happens with spin is that if something's going in left spin gravity, it comes out right spin gravity. Okay, so it comes in left, it goes out right. And so part of the interaction it has is that its spin is changed. And so you could argue that with a magnet, what's happening is that the gravity that goes in one part will come out, will be interpreted as it flies out of the object, proportionally. And that's, it gets a little tricky because you have to recognize that magnets are only creating, they're not changing the amount of gravity, they're not changing sensitivity to gravity, they're just making it, they're just recognizing a color difference. So you could say that the thing is the thing, and it comes in yellow or blue, and most all of matter is just, it doesn't care. It'll be affected by both yellow or blue, and it's only when it's in a certain condition that it can tell the difference between yellow and blue, and will therefore change its function based on which it encounters. So let's say that what's happening with magnetism is that there's a scale here from by percentage. So you could say that it'd be very small percentages, but let's just say from the North scale to the South pole, the difference is that this one is, for every photon that goes in, 10%, let's say, I'm just making up a number, but let's say 10% come out, with a left spin, let's say clockwise, clockwise and counterclockwise. There's probably better ways to do this. Just A or B would probably make it a little easier. And that here there would be a 0% come out at that spin, right? And so let's just do this. So B is, all right. And they're inverted. Okay, so this one is 10% C and 0% CC, and this one is 10% CC and 0% C. Okay, so that's changed the proportion of clockwise to counterclockwise spin. And the point being that they're invisible. The ones that are producing that counterclockwise is now invisible to clockwise. So it's doubling its sensitivity to one kind, and having its sensitivity to the other kind, in the sense that it will have less capacity to impact it, or no capacity. So you could argue that the graviton going through this side of the magnet would have no effect. It would just go right through it, and so there's no longer a shadowing effect. And that the one going through here would have exactly the opposite, where it is twice as likely to be shadowed. So there's twice as likelihood that nothing will come out this other side here, in terms of a clockwise spin. So there's 0 clockwise spin coming out of here, twice as many clockwise spins coming out of here. And so if you think about that, you can get the idea that if you reverse that magnet, the sensitivity would be exactly the opposite, and so the pressures would be exactly the opposite. This would end up being a high pressure, this would end up being a low pressure, and so that would be what causes the magnet to flip and smash into each other, is because their pressures are conducive. So if they have the opposite pressure effect. Yeah, well, anyway, so yeah, this is the kind of drawing I have to do ahead of time. But anyway, the point I wanted to get to is that I think if you just conceptually just think about it in a simpler sense, and just the idea that there's this two kinds, and that depending on the arrangement of the matter, it will essentially create this opposite force, in the sense that there will be created a reverse pressure. So what's happening with an atom, let's say, is that the gravity is going into the nucleus, and it's coming out as all, say, counterclockwise, and the electron is twice as sensitive to counterclockwise. So the force coming out of the nucleus is counterbalancing the force that comes out from gravity alone, from the external universe pushing. And it ends up being, there's a balance point where the proportion of double gravity coming out of here is equal, even though this is a small object and only a certain amount of gravity can get in there, right? So you got to understand that the electron's in this big circle. Okay, say of just its gravitational impact. It's in a field of gravity that is certainly much more dense than this little object in the center. And so the amount of gravity coming out of the center object has got to be less than the amount coming this way. But the point is that it's filtered it to its sensitivity. So it's almost like double gravity, in the sense that it's double pressure. The photons coming out, the gravitons coming out with the opposite spin, have twice the effect of the ones coming at it with both kinds of spin. Yeah. So I think you could sort of understand that magnetic objects are, although they are sensitive to gravity, they're also sensitive to a specific orientation of the gravity. So once they enter a field where gravity has been filtered, it's no longer a mixture 50-50, it's now a mixture of 40-60. They're going to behave differently, obviously, in that filtered environment than in the unfiltered environment. And that's sort of explained. So what I'm sort of arguing is that we can sort of see that the gravity comes out in these field lines, and all those represent is an intensity level. So the CC intensity is high here, and then it just diminishes, and then the C intensity, the intensity of the C produced, is high. So these two, when you see that classical pattern, what you're really seeing is these are all clockwisers, and these are all counterclockwisers, and they just diminish to a center point where they're 50-50 again, and then they're at the ends filtered more. But I'm saying the filtering is not absolute. It's only a tiny percentage, say 2%, or something. So obviously the magnet could be of different strengths, and so you could say this is a 2% magnet, or you could have a 10% magnet, or a 50% magnet, or a 100% magnet. So it's a really slight difference in how much is being filtered, but that slight difference has an obvious big difference in the sense that it'll certainly create a big difference in something that has no impetus. It will create an imbalance in the field. So something that's just floating in oil, let's say, and has no obligation to go anywhere necessarily, will be influenced by that change, that change in this field of conflict between the amount of counterclockwise photons and clockwise photons. And because it's sensitive to them, it will align appropriate to its sensitivity with that with the density of those photons. So I would argue that the photons are really just shooting out like this in straight lines, and that this is an illusion that's created by these are little magnets. They're not really just particles, right? I mean, these are little magnets that are lining up. So they're also sensitive. They have to be sensitive. They have to be ferrous. You know, they have to be capable of being magnetized, essentially. So they're magnetic pieces, and that's why they line up this way. Their alignment is just a representation of the balance between, you know, 10% CC and 10% clockwise. You know, 10% clockwise, 10% counterclockwise, you know, in terms of increase. And so they're just aligning up with the balance between those two. These lines are really an illusion just created by the fact that the objects will align themselves with the balance unless they need a velocity to push them one way or the other. The gradient isn't strong enough, the field isn't strong enough to actually force them over there. But as you'll see, in time, they all will force over. They will become, you know, as they are slightly vibrated and slightly moved in the medium, they eventually will coalesce in some comfortable area. They're all trying to get to this end. These are all trying to get to this end, and they just can't get there because there's stuff in their way, and so they end up clogging up just because, but they are trying to get there. Yeah. Yeah, well, see, and then it gets also, when you get into the dynamic that electricity is related to this magnetism. So part of this, the idea that they end up stuck to each other, is that the electrical effect. And so that's another thing to explain, because that creates an adhesion. And yeah, I'm not going to go into that right now. But that's more to do with just the idea that these magnets will end up sticking to each other end to end. You know, south to north, because of the way the field forces are going to end up being reinterpreted, and the low pressures and the high pressures are going to be, how their high and low pressure is going to be manipulated based on clockwise versus counterclockwise, and the fact that they are inversely sensitive to the opposite of what they're producing. So if an end is producing the clockwise spin, it's twice as sensitive to counterclockwise photons. Okay. I don't know. You know, this is, like I said, it does need a more specific and detailed drawing, but I don't want to go there yet because I'm still doing. I'm only explaining this to explain this. Okay, that's why this appears to have the same kind of field, in the sense that atoms end up fielding their electrons. It's because it's the same mechanism, and it just has to do with how sensitive the magnet is, how strong it is, will dictate, you know, how substantially it is polarized, whether it's 10% or 20% or 30%, will sort of dictate where its balanced position will be, its orbit. So these orbits are much more forced because they're a combination of a force that keeps pushing them, keeps hitting them in, and then a counter force that is pushing them out by changing the pressure. So you could almost say that an electron, let's say if it was a round object or spherical of some kind, it's got internal movements also, photons are moving inside, that what it basically might have is a dark side, a CC side and a C side. And so this side is pushed by the nucleus, creating counterclockwise photons pushing out, and it has these, and it's double sensitive to the clockwise photons on this side. And it just creates, like I said, depending on mass, would depend on what the balance would be in terms of how much it's being impacted by gravity versus how much it's being impacted by the gravity leaving the nucleus. Gravity goes in and always comes out. It doesn't stay. So gravity doesn't increase anything's mass. It doesn't stay with it. It just goes in and comes out. So it converts. It just takes this directional information. It's going this way, let's say, and all it does is change direction. So the gravity leaves in a certain direction, and like I said, the spin thing doesn't add energy. It just, again, adds it adds a dimension I'm just trying to come up with another word for it. It adds another possibility, another circumstance. I mean, like I said, it's not adding energy, but it's going to add, can't think of a good word for it. It obviously adds an opportunity for a manifestation of magnetism because it changed the spin. So I guess you could argue that we go back to a pool ball example. I'm saying this is all kinetic, but obviously if the pool balls are spinning as they collide with each other, the spin they would leave with would be opposite from the spin they had when they started. So they would exchange spin also. Yeah. So there's that's another element to understanding probably a lot of interactions between photons and electrons may be dependent on spin in terms of what direction exactly they go off on. Clockwise spin versus a counterclockwise spin in terms of the interaction, and there might be a completely, instead of it going this way, it goes that way. Same angles, let's say, but different left to right event or something like that. It'll change the kinetics. Some influence on the kinetics, but not in the sense that there's any change in the energy, just a change in direction. Is that enough? It's probably enough, but I mean, it's just something I want to. It's just something I thought of in terms of the idea of that there has to be this conservation of gravity, and the expression of that conservation is in the fact that gravity has to be expelled somewhere. And what it becomes is gravity again. Obviously, it's still moving, it's still going to impact other things, it's still part of the pressure. It's just that now there's more pressure in another direction. And I think people would argue that that's not happening because there's no evidence of extra gravity coming out of the sides of things. Like I have gravity going through me, but there's no evidence of more gravity being next to me. But that's because you have to understand it's only a tiny percentage of the gravity that my body is actually interacting with. Most of my gravity is going right through me. So you have to understand that this shadow effect, the idea that a body is shadowed by another body and that's what's pulling them together, this shadow is only created by a tiny percentage of gravity being blocked. I mean, it's like say 900 gravities went in this way. 899 will still come out straight ahead, and it's only this little bit that comes out of the sides here. So it's only a tiny percentage of gravity that has to interact with the matter and change it to change the overall direction it's going to move. Again, like with the school of fish argument, you have a million fish. Well, the only thing you have to do is have 5 or 6 fish spend a few more seconds going in this direction for the whole school to move in that direction at the speed of the fish's proportion to the total mass of the object. So, but it just doesn't take very much extra movement in a direction to realize a velocity. Yeah. So I would argue that the gravity is coming out of the side of me, that I am actually producing a repelling force, okay, in some other direction than the gravity that's being blocked. Be very careful of this one. I really haven't made sure of that one, because you could still argue that well, it just seems necessary that for there to be a directional, for the direction of the gravity photons to be having an effect on the matter, they have to interact with it, and you would it only seems rational to assume that they have to change direction. So they would have to lose some directional information to give it to the fish. So to influence the fish that are part of me, they would have to lose their directional information. They'd have to compromise some part of it. They couldn't maintain the same direction and then give direction to something else. Yeah. Okay. Alright, well, I'm not... it's not exactly what I wanted to say it or how I wanted to say it, but it's close enough to a video. It's just, there's these, these 10 pieces, 10 ideas, and you have to take these 10 elements of structure and be able to tie them all together, so it is a little bit gnarly. But I mean, the basic concept that it's all mechanical. There's no such thing as a force. Nothing just attracts and repels. It's being pushed. I guess the argument would be that it's all push. So the push of the photons pushing the electrons into the center of the nucleus, and then this push from the nucleus saying, "Screw you! Here's some, counterclockwise photons back at you." It's another force. It's another push. So it's just pushings everywhere. Everywhere's a push. There's no real pull. And the push is always in the form of a photon. So all these are graviton. So it's all just things moving and going and pushing things. And the push is always in the form of a change in direction. So all this really is a bunch of fish. The universe has, well, yeah, I guess I better go back to drawing, right? So the universe is made out of chaos fish, okay, just a zillions of them, all these fish moving in all kinds of directions, okay, and these are the gravitons that fill the universe. They're just all these fish moving in all kinds of directions, but all in straight lines. And so where they impact you, okay, the point they impact you, it has a vector. There's a straight line. It'll impart on you, and like I said, it will change its direction when it comes out. So the fish comes in one way, goes out another way, and it's just a change in direction. And then your fish has now, a fish that was going, say, this way inside of you is now going this way inside of you. So an element of this directionality is imposed as a change. So your photon was changed this angle, this directionality was elevated to this, while this was this lost this angle. So it's just an angular change that takes place as these fish interact. And is there anything significant here? Yeah, so obviously in the matter there's an arrangement that already exists, that's very complex in terms of fish being ordered and in structure. And so this is a chaos force essentially from the external world, and the order has to be is either the filter, okay, of this polarization and this other stuff is filtering that and creating a pattern by filtering. So it's taking the chaos out of this and creating fish that are more likely to be moving in a singular direction, creating the movement of mass. And so what I want to, but it's really a great analogy. I think this whole fish thing is just brilliant in terms of visualizing that it's the pieces and it's just arrangements. And like I said, it does explain time dilation and all that stuff, because to move something that has a pattern, the pattern has to slow down. It has to degrade as a pattern the more movement you impose on it, because more of the fish are moving in a direction. And I also love the idea of recognizing that when the fish are in chaos, their energy is in all directions, right? So when fish are swarming but not going anywhere, just swimming in circles around each other, their force is in all directions essentially. And it's only when they start to get organized in the sense that they are filtered and then they start moving in one direction. The interesting thing is they have no mass, they have no force, they have no mass in any other direction. Their mass is all in one direction, and that's what we perceive as energy, is that alignment of directionality. But it's really not. I mean, it's just that their force is no longer being chaotically spread in all directions. It's now in one direction. I think that's useful, but it has to be rephrased. So anyway, enough said. And so till next time, try getting some more. But anyway, it's just the only thing that inspired this video, and I just wanted to do a little talking about it, was this idea that the origins of magnetism are probably in the atomic nucleus, and this relationship between the proton and the neutron and the electron, and the fact that what they're basically doing is converting gravity differently and producing these clockwise versus counterclockwise photons, and then in turn having a material structure, a shape or form that is more susceptible to one than the other. A dark side and a light side of the moon, and thinking about it in terms of the light side being more sensitive to one, the dark side being more sensitive to the other, and how that would create a pressure gradient. Okay, enough. Until next time.